The worst part of being old is remembering when you were young. That quiet sentence, spoken by Richard Farnsworth, lingers like a shadow in the heart. It wasn't just a line, it was a farewell, a final truth whispered by a man who had lived a life far from the spotlight, only to touch it briefly before fading away again. In a world of noise, Farnsworth chose silence. In a town of spectacle, he embodied dignity. For most of his life, he wasn't even a face the audience remembered. He was the man who fell from horses, who got thrown from wagons, who risked his body so that the stars could shine. A stuntman, anonymous, invisible, essential. He worked on over 300 films without applause, without interviews, without bitterness. He didn't need to be seen, he just wanted to do the work. But fate has a strange sense of timing. At an age when most actors are forgotten, Farnsworth became unforgettable. In 1999, at 79 years old and in constant pain from terminal cancer, he gave the performance of his life in The Straight Story, a quiet, haunting journey of an old man riding a lawnmower across America to reconcile with his estranged brother. No explosions, no special effects, just truth, tenderness, and time. That performance earned him an Oscar nomination, the oldest Best Actor nominee in Academy history at the time. But the applause came too late. Hollywood finally saw him just as he was preparing to leave. 1 year later, he took his own life, alone, at his ranch in New Mexico. He left behind a note, not of sorrow, but of clarity. He didn't want cancer to strip him of his strength, his grace, his choice. This is not a sensational story. This is not a tragedy of excess. This is something rarer, a quiet life lived with honor, and a death that asked for no attention. So why do we tell it now? Because Richard Farnsworth reminds us of something we've forgotten in the noise, that there is beauty in stillness, courage in restraint, and sometimes the softest voices leave the deepest echoes. This is his story. Richard William Farnsworth was born on September 3, 1920 in Los Angeles, California, just miles from the dream factory of Hollywood. But unlike most who grow up near the studios, he never dreamed of becoming a star. His childhood was shaped by the Great Depression, by work, by silence, and by horses. Long before he learned to speak lines, he learned to break mustangs and fall from saddles. After losing his father at a young age, Richard took on odd jobs to support his family. At 16, he worked as a stable hand, feeding and caring for animals used in Western films. It wasn't long before someone noticed the way he rode, calm, controlled, unshaken, and asked if he'd be willing to take a fall for the camera. That simple question became the doorway to a 30-year career as a stuntman. He never studied acting, he studied pain, how to fall convincingly, how to be dragged behind a horse without breaking your neck, how to vanish into smoke so the hero could rise. He was in Gone with the Wind, Red River, The 10 Commandments, Spartacus, but you'd never know it. His name was buried in the credits, or not there at all. But Farnsworth didn't resent his anonymity. He wore it like armor. He wasn't chasing fame. He was a working man in a working town, showing up, doing the job, and going home. In his own words,
"I wasn't trying to be a star, I just liked the work."
By the 1960s and 70s, as other stuntmen retired or faded away, Richard's presence grew more dignified, more magnetic. Casting directors began to notice the quiet steadiness in him, not flashy, not rehearsed, just real. And eventually someone offered him a speaking role. It was late, he was nearly 60, but somehow the timing was perfect. Because all those years in the background had given him something no acting school could teach: authenticity, a weathered grace, a face that didn't need to perform because it had already lived. In an industry obsessed with youth and reinvention, Farnsworth's rise was almost an accident. But perhaps it was also a reminder that sometimes greatness doesn't arrive early, it waits, quietly. Fame wasn't something Richard Farnsworth chased, it found him late and reluctantly. By the time the spotlight reached him, his face was already lined with sun and time, his voice low and worn, like the saddle of a horse that had seen too many trails. But maybe that's what made him so unforgettable. In 1978, at nearly 60 years old, he starred in Comes a Horseman alongside Jane Fonda and James Caan. Playing a weathered rancher, Farnsworth delivered a performance that was tender, grounded, and heartbreakingly real. The Academy took notice. He was nominated for Best Supporting Actor at the Oscars. It was a shock to Hollywood and to him. "I never imagined this," he said with genuine disbelief. "I just wanted to do right by the part." But his fame didn't explode, it simmered. He chose his roles with care, never more than 1 or 2 films a year, always characters that reflected dignity, humility, and the quiet complexity of rural life. He appeared in The Grey Fox, 1982, portraying aging train robber Bill Miner, a role that cemented his reputation as a leading man of late bloom. Critics called it a miracle of understatement. Through the 1980s and 90s, Farnsworth became a sort of cinematic ghost, appearing here and there, always memorable, always gentle. There was no reinvention, no dramatic makeover. He played who he was, a man who had lived, who had loved, who had lost. Then came 1999 and The Straight Story. Directed by David Lynch, known for surreal, unsettling films, this was a departure, a simple, real story based on true events. Farnsworth played Alvin Straight, a 73-year-old man who travels hundreds of miles on a lawnmower to visit his ailing brother. No car, no drama, just a slow, aching journey across small towns and open fields. The performance was quiet brilliance. Every gesture felt lived in. Every line was weighted with history. It wasn't acting, it was remembering. And the Academy remembered him again, a Best Actor nomination at age 79, making him the oldest nominee at that time. Farnsworth didn't win the statue, but in the hearts of audiences he had already won something deeper: respect, reverence. A place among the few who proved that great art doesn't need noise, it just needs truth. Behind Richard Farnsworth's weathered face and slow, deliberate voice was a man who lived for simplicity, on screen and off. Long before the cameras ever lingered on him, he had already found his greatest role: husband and father. He married Margaret Hill, a woman as private and grounded as he was. For over 38 years they built a life away from Hollywood's noise, choosing small-town peace over industry parties. They raised 2 children together, Dee Diamond and Missy, and Farnsworth never once allowed fame to get in the way of fatherhood. He remained the same ranchman, the same trail rider, the same husband who came home with dusty boots and quiet stories. They lived in New Mexico, far from the studios and flashing lights. Theirs was a world of open fields, stables, and a front porch that caught the last of the evening sun. Friends described their relationship as steady, warm, and deeply respectful. There were no headlines, no scandals, just a quiet companionship built on years of shared time. In 1985, that quiet life cracked. Margaret passed away. The loss was deep, private, and unrecoverable. Farnsworth never remarried. He once said in an interview, "You get one great love if you're lucky. I had mine." After her death, he withdrew even further from public life, splitting his time between work and solitude. When not filming, he retreated to his ranch, tending to animals, watching the seasons change, and walking the land he knew like an old friend. There was no entourage, no assistant, just Richard and the wind. He never sought to reinvent himself, never leaned into celebrity. To the end, he remained a man who valued peace over attention. Fame had come, yes, but it never rewrote the blueprint of his life. In many ways, Richard Farnsworth was the antithesis of the Hollywood image. He didn't burn bright and fast, he endured. His love for his wife, his loyalty to his family, and his retreat into stillness after her passing painted the portrait of a man who never needed applause to feel fulfilled. And as time passed, and the world moved faster around him, he stood still, anchored by love, softened by grief, and held together by a quiet kind of strength that no script could ever capture. For a man who had made a career falling off horses and getting trampled in westerns, Richard Farnsworth was no stranger to pain. But nothing could have prepared him for the private war that began in the late 1990s, a war his body would not let him win. He was diagnosed with terminal prostate cancer that had metastasized into his bones. The pain was relentless. Each movement was agony, each breath laced with fire. Doctors offered treatments, but they came with side effects Farnsworth couldn't bear. Weakness, confusion, a slow erosion of the man he had always been. He refused them all. Instead, he chose stillness. He remained at his New Mexico ranch, surrounded by desert wind and the long shadows of late afternoons. To the world, he simply disappeared. No public statements, no tearful interviews, no press. It was as if he had vanished, except he hadn't. He was still there, quietly suffering, quietly holding on. Hollywood didn't know, or perhaps it didn't ask. After all, Richard wasn't the kind of man who made noise, and in an industry that often equates silence with irrelevance, his suffering remained invisible. Just a year earlier, he had been nominated for an Oscar. Now, he could barely walk across the room. The hardest part wasn't the pain, it was the loss of independence. Farnsworth had lived his life by his own code, honest work, quiet dignity, and the freedom to stand on his own 2 feet. As the disease took that from him, something in him began to break. He reportedly spent his final months reflecting, not on awards or roles, but on love, on his wife Margaret, on his children, on the simple joys of riding at sunrise. Friends who visited him said he never complained. He smiled, even as the pain tightened around him like a vice. There were no paparazzi outside his home, no headlines counting down his days. He was fading the way he had lived, in peace, in silence. But inside, a decision was forming, a decision shaped not by despair, but by a desire to leave this world on his own terms before it stripped him of the last things he could still call his own. The body may have been breaking, but the dignity, that remained untouched. On October 6, 2000, in the quiet solitude of his ranch in Lincoln, New Mexico, Richard Farnsworth took his final ride, one not captured by a camera, but forever imprinted in memory. At 80 years old, the man who had endured more falls than most could count made a final choice that stunned those who knew him. He took his own life with a single gunshot. There was no scandal, no chaos, just a note left behind with clarity and grace. In it, Farnsworth explained what so many had not known, that the pain had become unbearable, that the disease had taken too much, and that he would rather be remembered for how he lived than be watched slowly deteriorating in silence. He wasn't running from life, he was preserving what was left of it. The news sent a quiet shockwave through Hollywood. This wasn't a troubled actor lost in excess. This was a man who had just been nominated for an Oscar, a man who, only a year earlier, had given the performance of a lifetime in The Straight Story, a film that now seemed almost prophetic. As Alvin Straight, Farnsworth had played a man confronting death, memory, and regret. Now it was clear. He hadn't been acting. He had been saying goodbye His death was not dramatic. It was not meant to be discussed on talk shows or dissected in tabloids. It was deeply personal, a final act of control from a man who had built his life on quiet decisions. Only a small group of friends and family attended the private service. No red carpet, no studio tributes, just a few weathered faces, a gentle wind, and the sound of boots on desert ground. One friend said he went out the way he lived on his own terms with dignity. There are those who would call it tragic, others selfish, but perhaps it was something else entirely. Perhaps it was a final act of courage. In a world where most fight to stay in the light, Richard Farnsworth chose the shadows. Not because he feared life, but because he had lived it fully. And when the time came, he knew how to let go. His last ride wasn't on a horse or a lawnmower. It was into memory, and he rode it alone. Richard Farnsworth never chased a legacy. He didn't walk into rooms expecting recognition or applause. And yet, after he was gone, something remarkable happened. People remembered. Not with fanfare, but with reverence. His name now rests permanently on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, not only for his acting, but for his decades of work as a stuntman, a rare double honor. The man who once fell from horses anonymously in Gone with the Wind is now honored for a career that spanned nearly 60 years, marked by grace, grit, and unwavering humility. The Straight Story continues to move audiences around the world. It's often cited as director David Lynch's most human film, gentle, warm, and heartbreaking. And it owes much of that soul to Farnsworth's performance. Critics call it a masterclass in restraint. Viewers, decades later, still write that his portrayal of Alvin Straight felt like watching someone tell their own story. And in a way it was. For many, Farnsworth became the face of a different kind of masculinity, one not rooted in dominance or ego, but in kindness, reflection, and silent strength. In a Hollywood that often shouts, he whispered, and people listened. He's remembered by fellow actors not just for his talent, but for his decency. On set, he was the one who arrived early, stayed late, and treated everyone, from directors to crew, with equal respect. He never had a scandal, never lashed out, never forgot where he came from. To aspiring actors, his story offers a quiet hope that it's never too late, that talent doesn't expire, and that being a good human being might matter more than the number of headlines you make. His life wasn't made of blockbusters or box office records. It was built on the kind of authenticity that lingers, like the sound of wind through an open field, or the slow hum of a tractor crossing empty miles. Simple and unforgettable. In death, Richard Farnsworth left behind no empire, no memoir, no final interview. Just films, just memories, just a trail of performances that remind us you don't have to be loud to leave an echo. What does it mean to live a good life? Richard Farnsworth never spoke of legacy, but his life answers that question more eloquently than most speeches ever could. He didn't rise through scandal or shine through self-promotion. He built his name with quiet choices, patient years, and the steady heartbeat of decency. In a world that celebrates noise, he chose stillness, and in that stillness he became something timeless. He taught us that dignity doesn't have to come in grand gestures, that true strength can exist in vulnerability, that you can be 60, 70, even 80 and still have something important to give. His roles weren't loud, but they left impressions. The aging outlaw, the soft-spoken brother, the man on a lawnmower crossing states for reconciliation. He reminded us that art is not always about transformation. It can also be about transparency. And when he could no longer carry his pain, he left us with the hardest truth of all, that endings too can be honest. But his story shouldn't just be remembered, it should be felt. The next time you watch The Straight Story, let yourself sit with the silences. Listen to the wind, the hum of the engine, the pauses between words. That's Richard Farnsworth. That's a man speaking not just through dialogue, but through presence. And maybe in your own life, let his example guide you. Take your time. Say less. Mean more. Love deeply, even if only once. Choose peace over spectacle. And when the trail gets rough, ride it with grace. We don't all get our names on the walk of fame, but we all leave something behind, an echo, a memory, a gesture of kindness. Farnsworth's echo is quiet but enduring, like a final scene that fades not to black but to gold. So if his story moved you, don't just remember him, live a little more like him. And if this tribute resonated with you, we invite you to share it. Leave a comment below. What does Richard Farnsworth's journey make you think about your own? Because sometimes the smallest lives leave the deepest footprints.